Hey y'all, and welcome to FamilyPreneur, the podcast for family-first entrepreneurs building profitable and progressive businesses. If we haven't met yet, I'm your host, Meg Brunson, and my pronouns are she, her. Before we get started, I want to remind you that this podcast episode isn't going to change a thing in your business unless you take action. And the best way to follow through is by joining us inside of the FamilyPreneur Business Accelerator. It's where we work, win, celebrate, and grow together. Head over to familypreneur.co to join us today. All right, let's do this. Hey there, Familypreneurs. I'm excited to be here today with Jen Lumanlan. Jen holds a master's degree in psychology and child development and a master's in education. She hosts the Your Parenting Mojo podcast, which is a reference guide for parents of children aged between toddler and preschool years based on scientific research and the principles of respectful parenting. In each episode, she examines a topic related to parenting and child development from all sides to help parents understand how to make decisions about raising their children. She lives in California with her husband and daughter, and today we are going to talk about taming our triggers as parents with Jen Lumanlan. Jen, thank you so much for being here today. I cannot wait to chat about this topic with you.
Thanks for having me, Meg. And I should point out that while most of the parents I work with have children on the younger end, the ideas we're going to talk about together today are relevant really no matter what age your child is, even if your child is grown and flown.
Grown and flown. I like that. Well, I think let's first talk about triggers. Like, why, as parents, why are we triggered so much by our kids? Why do we have such a hard time when our kids misbehave? I'm putting in quotes.
Yeah, the old air quotes. Yeah, I think it's really tempting for us parents to see our children's behavior as the problem, because that's kind of the culture we grew up in, right? That's what we were taught when we were kids, is that if our parent is disapproving of us in some way, then it's our fault. It's our behavior that needed to change. And so that's sort of the model that we grew up in. And so it's, in a way, it's natural for us to think, well, I am having these big reactions to my child's behavior. Clearly, there's something wrong with my child's behavior. I've been on earth for a long time now. I was doing fine. I wasn't exploding all the time and having these big reactions until my child came along. My child is here, and now I'm having these big reactions. And so clearly, if my child would just stop doing this thing that pushes my buttons, then I wouldn't need to have these big reactions, right? So it's sort of built into the way that we were raised. And it turns out that changing our child's behavior is firstly difficult, because who likes to have their behavior changed, right? Nobody likes to try and have their behavior changed by somebody else. And then secondly, it's actually not super effective, because it turns out that the real reason why we feel triggered has nothing to do with our child's behavior. And it has everything to do with things that we experience, either in terms of things that happen to us as children, in our relationships with our parents, our caregivers, or, I mean, frankly, ongoing trauma that's happening right now with all of the stuff that's happening in the world with the pandemic, which seemed as though we were going to be able to make it through a short stretch and then a bit longer stretch and then a bit longer stretch. And now we're looking at the point where it's like, is there an end? And all of a sudden, it just feels so incredibly deflating and defeating. And so we're trying to navigate this at the same time as our children are still doing all the age-appropriate stuff that children do.
So basically, we're overwhelmed in dealing with all of our own mess, whatever that is, stresses and things like that. And so our kids being typical kids is stressing us out, is triggering us and causing that reaction.
Yeah. And particularly when our children do something that touches something that was traumatic for us. So maybe our parents had a thing around mess in the house, and you do not make a mess, and they would freak out every time we made a mess in the house. And then our kid is walking through the house and they spill glitter on the floor. And we just...
It had to be glitter. Glitter.
Yes, it couldn't have been anything else that would have been easy to sweep or easy to vacuum. It had to be glitter that you know you're going to be living with for the next 6 months, and you just lose it. And so, of course, it seems like if your child would just be more careful, then you wouldn't have needed to have this reaction. But actually, where this came from is that old hurt, that old memory of the way your parent or caregiver reacted to you when you did something like making a mess. And of course, make a mess is one example. These kinds of traumas come up in so many different areas of our lives. I mean, with the parents that I work with, I've heard from parents who their parent would say, "Oh, well, stop being lazy. Just come along and walk." And now, when their child refuses to walk, they have the explosion. Or another parent, whenever their child today says, "Mom, mom, mom," anything that is remotely needy, because this parent was taught never be needy. It's not okay to be needy. You need to be self-sufficient. You can't rely on anybody else. And so as soon as her child exhibits something that looks even remotely like neediness, that's triggered, that old trauma is triggered in her that is not healed. And of course, she has a huge reaction to her child's just saying mom 3 times in a row.
And I'm curious. So I feel like in my head, there's 2 ways that you can kind of react to the things that your parents did for you. You either do the same thing or you do the opposite thing. Do you know what I mean? Like
yes.
Is it more common to do one of those things than the other? Like I remember instances growing up, and this is not meant to be a slam against my parents or anything like that. Yeah. But I remember instances where I'd be like, when I grow up, I will never do that to my children. And there are some things now that I purposely and intentionally do not approach in the same way that they were approached with me. So I guess I'm just curious, like, what makes sometimes you do the exact same thing that your parents did to you, and what makes you do the opposite? Does that make sense?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. It's funny you mentioned that, actually. I sort of developed a theory about that myself. I think in my teenage years, long before I was even remotely interested in having children, that generationally we must sort of pendulum back and forth between the two, is in reaction to what our parents did, and each time saying, "Oh, I'm never doing that. Well, I'm never doing that. Well, I'm never doing that." And we just go back and forth from one side to the other. And I think which way you end up going depends a lot on your temperament, your personality, on what was modeled for you and how scary that was for you, on what your coping mechanisms were, and whether your coping mechanism was to try to fight back, as it were, to stand up, or whether your coping mechanism was to sort of get into the shell and hide, or to run away, or to placate. I've worked with parents who say that when they were 5 years old and their own parents were in the middle of really big conflagrations, this parent I'm working with would bring everybody cups of tea to try and smooth things over. And they're like 5 years old, bringing everybody cups of tea to try and smooth things over. So there's a lot of different factors involved. But I think the key part that we're talking about here is whichever one of those 2 things you're doing, you're reacting. You're reacting to something that has come before. You're not healed. You're not responding. You're not choosing how to interact with your child from a place that's aligned with your values. And that's ultimately where we want to be going towards, so that we're not reacting to something and either saying in the moment, my parent exploded at me and the only thing I know how to do is explode, or my parent exploded at me and the only thing I know how to do is to placate you and make sure everything's okay. But that we're actually saying, what's really important to me here? What are my values here in this relationship with my child? And what can I do to, in those difficult moments, be able to try to connect with those values and respond from a place that's aligned with those values, rather than whichever side of the pendulum we're sort of naturally gravitating towards.
And that all makes total sense to me. And I'm just thinking, in my own family, like, the most conflict is with my oldest daughter, who I think is because she's the most like me. So we kind of,
Funny that, isn't it? Yeah. But and all the things you were punished for doing when you were a child, she's now doing, and oof, that hurts. Yeah.
So I think with that, like, the biggest issue for me is that when she does something, anything, it's that reaction, right? It's
Yeah.
like instant. I feel like sometimes the reaction happens so instantly that
Yeah.
like you can't stop it from happening. And so
Yeah.
is there a strategy for like, I don't know, taking a deep breath?
Yes.
I feel like that sounds so easy. Like
It
right now
sounds
it
so
sounds
trite,
so
doesn't it?
easy.
Yeah. Yeah.
But like what is the strategy for like for putting
Yeah.
some space in between
Yeah.
the action of your child and
Mm.
your knee-jerk reaction?
Yeah, yeah, that's such a great question, because that's exactly what to focus on, because it's in that space that you get to make a decision, that you get to decide how to respond based on your values instead of just reacting. And so I think the typical pattern that parents tend to fall into is, well, I know I need to take a deep breath, and I know I need to pause, and I didn't do it again. And if I know this, why can't I just do it? Right? I have the knowledge. Our culture says if you have the knowledge, then all you need to add is enough willpower and you'll be able to make the change. And so if you haven't been able to make the change, then clearly your willpower is the thing that's at fault here. And that's your fault. And so self-flagellation kicks in, and the guilt and the shame of, why is it always like this? Why can't I make this different? And so it's sort of this really bad spiral that we get into when we do this over and over again. And so I actually teach a workshop on taming your triggers. And one of the big things that we work on is creating that pause, because that pause is really where the magic happens. And what I typically see is I see parents, when they start to focus on this, they go through a number of phases. Firstly, they're in the phase where you are looking back at an event that happened and you're thinking, I should have done that differently. The whip comes out and you think, why can't I do this? And then if you keep focusing on that, what you will find is the next phase you'll probably go through is you'll see it happening in the moment and you'll think, I know I need to create a pause here, but it's not going to happen. And I'm going to say the thing I'm going to say anyway. And it's going to be really bad. You might even have an out of body experience. I've talked to parents who are like, I can see myself saying it. And I know that in 10 minutes, I'm going to be apologizing, but I can't stop myself. And so that can be a sort of a discouraging phase. And you keep focusing on it in the difficult moment, taking a deep breath, putting a hand on a heart, doing something that feels nourishing and creating a moment of space. And then it comes. At first, it's so tiny that it's almost not even enough to make any kind of decision. And then you keep focusing on it. It gets a little bit longer. And that creates the moment that you need to make that decision. And so there's a lot of different tools you can use to do that. There's mantras that you can stick on the fridge to remind yourself. A lot of parents I work with actually like to put a hair tie around one wrist. And then that's sort of a visual reminder. And then in the moment that their child says something, they grab hold of the hair tie, take it off one wrist and put it on the other wrist. And that, it takes 4 or 5 seconds to do that. And there's your pause, right? That connects you with your intention. My intention is how I want to show up in my relationship with my child. You've got your pause. You've taken a deep breath, and then you can say what's true for you. You're not squashing it down. You're not, I'm fine. That wasn't irritating to me at all through gritted teeth. You can say, I'm super frustrated right now, and be really honest about that. But you're coming at it from a place of, this is what's true for me, not, why did you do that thing? Right?
So talking about your feelings rather than projecting what you think.
Yes. Yeah,
the
to
kiddo
start with.
has,
Of course, then you're going to go into, there's a whole conversation that you can have from there about what was happening here and why was the child doing this thing. And chances are it was for some reason that you didn't even realize was a thing for them. And then you can share what was going on for you. But all of that comes from having created the pause. And you're never going to do it perfectly. And I'm going to confess, last night I screwed up. I had 6 hours of back-to-back recordings and interviews, and then I had to go grocery shopping and pick her up from school, and she was having a hard time and she wanted to watch video games. And then, I asked her to turn off the video games, and she's like, okay, where's my dinner? And I'm like, for real? And so, yeah, I had a moment where I am not a yeller, but I said firmly, for real. And she was upset, and we had a difficult moment, and I was not able to connect with my values in that moment, because what we call the window of tolerance was really narrow. I'd had so many other things going on that day that my window of tolerance for her behavior was really, really narrow. If I had maybe scheduled fewer things that day, or had asked my husband to go grocery shopping instead of having me do it, then I would have been able to widen my window of tolerance and respond to her. So lesson learned for me, right? It's my behavior that needs to change. Yes, we can talk about helping other people instead of demanding dinner at the moment your video games are over. We can have that conversation too, and we will. But there's a lot that I can do about this situation that would have made it better.
And I appreciate that example, because I think when I'm thinking about my triggers and my behaviors that need to be changed, I'm thinking about the extremes. Mm-hmm. So like and I don't want to make it sound worse than it is, right? But like the shouting or the screaming.
Yeah.
And I'm not really thinking about like the eye roll.
Yeah.
The eye roll that I make, that my kids see and perceive. Yeah. And that is just as misaligned with my values as raising my voice. So I appreciate that example, because I think it makes me realize that it's not just the extremes that I was initially thinking of. Can we talk a little bit maybe about like what some of those other reactions might be that we as, and not just as parents, right, but just as humans, like I feel like it's a human thing, like that we typically might do that could be benefited by taming.
Yeah, it's funny you mention eye rolls, because we hate it when our kids roll their eyes at us, right?
But somehow we still do it.
Yeah, exactly. I think so that there's 4 main patterns of behavior that parents tend to fall into when they are feeling triggered. And the first of those is fight. So that's when maybe you're a yeller, you're exploding, you might even sort of swat or spank your child. There's very much sort of a big physical presence here for them, whether that's expressed verbally or expressed physically. So that's the fight. Then there's the flight, where you leave as fast as possible. And there are plenty of parents who do that too. And that can be physically leaving the room, or mentally and emotionally leaving the room, and just kind of checking out, because it's not safe to be here. If you think back to your own childhood and the interactions you had with your parents or caregivers, then it wasn't safe to be fully present in that interaction with them, and so your mind went somewhere else. If your body it wasn't acceptable for your body to go somewhere else. So there's the flight. Then there's freezing, which is when it's like deer in the headlights. Like I can't move, I can't make any decision, I can't do anything. Some people describe it as almost like having a foot on the brake and the accelerator at the same time. It's like everything's spinning and the tension is ramping up, but nothing's moving. And then the final one is the fawn. And we typically see that in parents who have experienced pretty bad abuse or trauma. And that pattern comes up when you are trying to get the abuser to stop doing the thing. And so you tell them anything that you think they want to hear to make that stop. And so then we see that showing up in relationships with children. When our children cry or scream, it's like, okay, whatever you want, I'll get the ice cream. Just stop crying. It's okay. And so we try to placate them to make their feelings better, so that we then don't have to feel those difficult feelings. So that's typically the ways that we see it show up. And of course, there's variation in each of those as well, in terms of severity and the types of things that parents actually do.
Sure. And the same strategy of like giving that pause to allow you to regroup would work in all of the situations.
Yes, it really does. And what it does is allows you to do what psychologists call reappraise, which means to take another look at the situation and to assess what's really happening here. I think that when we have these big reactions, our first when we're early to the journey of learning about it, we know we're not supposed to do it, right? we're not supposed to show up in our relationships with our children this way. But here we are having these big feelings. And so the thing that we think we must need to do is to stuff that down, is to just kind of put it away somewhere and pretend that it's not there, and not really deal with it as we have not dealt with it for the rest of our lives. When actually, if we can take that pause and reappraise the situation, what we'll probably find is that we can see it from a different perspective. So maybe, I don't know, I have a vase that has been in my family for a long time, and it's delicate and it's not expensive, but it has a lot of sentimental value to me. Maybe, and this has not happened. It's just a made up example. Maybe my daughter knocks it over and it breaks. And my narrative immediately goes to, you're so careless. And, I told you a million times not to touch it. And what were you thinking? And anything else my parent would have said to me if I had broken something important to them. And then maybe we can pause and take a breath, and we can see what was actually going on for the child. Were they super excited about something that's happening in the house that day? Were they even coming to bring us a cup of tea? And they were so focused on the cup of tea that they didn't see how close they were to the vase, right? And it was an accident that could have happened to anybody. And so that reappraisal helps us to see what's actually here. Not what are the stories am I telling about how careless my child is and how that connects to the trauma that I've experienced, but what's really here. And then we can be honest about what's here for us again. You don't have to say, oh yeah, that's fine. That didn't mean that much to me. We can say, oh my goodness, I'm so sad and I'm so disappointed. That was really important to me. And then maybe our child will offer to help clean it up, or maybe there's something we can do together that will help me to connect with things that are important to me and my family. Like we could look at pictures together, family pictures or something, so that this is not the only thing that's connecting me to my family history. So that's what that moment of reappraisal can do for us.
And now, on the flip side of things, we can't change the past, right? If we have, if we're aware, that we messed up, and it's too late for the pause. Like the trigger has already occurred. The damage has already been done, whether it's an eye roll or raising the voice or whatever.
Yeah.
What's the next step? And it doesn't matter how old your kids are, because that's the other thing. Like, I'm coming at this in my mind with my 14-year-old in mind, because I love her to death, but I feel like she's the one right now who just requires the most guidance. But I also know, like, I have a 6-year-old, and it wasn't long ago that she was 3, and at those ages, you can't have the same conversations necessarily. So I'm just curious.
You can't have the same conversations, but you can have similar kinds of conversations. So let's look at how that would play out at those two different ages then, right? At the opposite ends of the spectrum. So let's say that your 3-year-old had broken something that was really important to you, and you exploded, you yelled at them, and then afterwards you realize, that didn't go well. Then we want to address it. If the child is still upset right now, and we have been able to re-regulate ourselves, then I would say it's okay to address it now if you feel as though you can. If you're still completely emotionally dysregulated, then I would say now is not the moment to address that. Comfort the child if necessary, and just kind of move on for a little bit. And then when everybody's re-regulated and had something to eat, and you're not tired and you're not under pressure to get dinner ready or whatever else is going on in your life, you could say something like, we had a really hard time earlier, didn't we? Would it be okay if we talk about it for a minute? And then assuming they say yes, you can just kind of start telling the story of what happened. And the reason that this is important is when we mess up, there's a real tendency to want to hide it, to pretend it didn't happen. Like maybe if I don't say anything, they just won't remember. But we remember, right? We remember when our parents blew up at us. We don't remember what the thing was we did, but we remember when they blew up at us. And so what we're doing is we're working on integrating the memories so that it doesn't become this flagship memory of our child's in their adult life. So we're starting this conversation and we're saying something like, oh my goodness, it seemed as though we were doing okay, and then I was in the other room and I heard this big crash, and then I came in and the vase was on the floor, and what was going on? And then we can allow space for our child to tell their part of the story. So maybe there was something we don't even know about that they were trying to do. And if not, we can prompt them along a bit. Oh, okay. So you were running from here to here, and did you not see the vase, or did you forget it was there, or your elbow was sticking out? Or so you're sort of helping them to tell their part of the story. And then you're being honest about it. I was so frustrated because that vase is really important to me. And I'm really disappointed that it's broken, and just allow that to be, right? You don't have to rub it in or teach them a lesson about being more careful. The lesson is there. They see your genuine disappointment. And then, well, what can we do to work on repairing this? The vase is it's gone. We can't mend it, and I'm really disappointed about that. But well, it was important to me because our family is important to me, and I wanted you to have it one day. And I wonder, maybe we could do something together that helps us both to see how important our family is to us. Did you want to go and look at some family pictures together? And we can tell stories about our family, and maybe even I could write some of the stories down of the things that we remember, right? So that my need, the need that I was trying to meet through keeping the vase is keeping family traditions alive and showing the importance of our family. And I'm still meeting that need in a different way. So does that make sense from the 3-year-old's perspective?
It does.
Yeah. Okay. And so we're providing as much of the story as we need to invite them into this process, but allowing them to tell their part of it to the extent that they can. And the more you do this, you're not trying to invent reasons to repair with them, but the more often you do this, the more they're able to do it. With a 14-year-old, that can look, the process is similar. Obviously, the words you're going to use are different. You could still start with, we had a really freaking hard time this morning, didn't we? Would it be okay if we talk about that? And you're asking their permission. You're not saying we're going to talk about this now. We're inviting them into this conversation. And we have to be, just as with a 3-year-old, we have to be willing to accept no as an answer. And if they don't want to talk about it, then that's okay. It's an invitation to talk about it. And then really coming from a place of vulnerability from our perspective. We even practiced this vulnerability with my child when she was really, really young, which is incredibly, I find it really empowering. I think most parents sort of feel as though they have to have this veneer of, I've got it all together and I know what I'm doing. Whereas when you tell your child, I'm making this up as I go along and I'm doing the best I can, then it sort of invites them into this process of figuring out together, how are we going to be together in this relationship, rather than I have all the answers and I'm going to tell you how it's going to be. So that conversation with a 14-year-old might go something like, do you want to give me an example of an issue you're having with a 14-year-old so we can make it more real?
Oh, gosh. Sure. Not doing her one super easy chore of the day.
Okay, sure. And what's the chore?
Dishes. Lunch dishes. Specifically.
Okay, super. All right. So then it could go something like, hey, would you mind if we talk for a minute about chores? And you could reassure, I'm not gonna get on your case about it. I would like to have a conversation with you where we can figure out why it's hard for you to do this and why it's important to me, and see if we can figure out something that works for both of us. Is that okay? And so assuming they say yes, you could say something like, I've noticed that you have a really hard time doing the dishes, and it's something that I've asked you to do. And I'm really curious about why it's difficult for you. What's going on for you when you're doing the dishes? And so what you're listening for is how they're feeling about it. Are they feeling like it's taking them away from something else they'd rather be doing at that time, or it's boring, or whatever it is? There could be 15 things that are going on for them that they're feeling in that moment. And then, okay, so what's going on for me here? Well, it's important to me to feel as though I'm not the only one doing all the work in the family here. Or I have regular meetings from 12 to 2 and I don't have time to do the dishes. So what's true for me here? And then from there, what paths do we have that potentially could meet both of our needs? And this is going to vary depending on what each of our needs are. So if my need is to feel as though I'm not the only one carrying the weight of the family, there's 100 different ways that this child could help to reduce some of that burden on me, to help us feel as though we're part of a team. One of those ways is dishes. There are, putting the trash out, making beds, cleaning, a whole host of things that may be more acceptable, maybe less boring. Maybe they could listen to a podcast to make that chore less boring. So we're approaching it from a perspective of how can I help my child meet whatever need they have articulated as to why they're struggling to do the dishes. And is it even necessary to do the dishes? Would it be helpful to me, just as helpful in terms of meeting my need of not carrying the entire weight of the family, if they did some other chore that's more acceptable to them? How do you think they would respond to a conversation like that?
I think in most cases, she's like a very tune-out person. So I feel like that's the tough part for me, is getting her to care about the conversation we're having. And that being said, I'm also fully aware that I am passing judgment on the way she is participating, in the conversation. So she's like, you talked about, I can't remember which example it was, maybe flight, right? Where she's there physically, but I feel like she's not with me. Yeah. So and I think the more, I also know the times that she's most likely to open up. So, I mean, there's definitely strategies. Like, I could take her on a drive and, you know what I mean? Like, there's definitely ways in which we communicate easier. Yeah. But I feel like it goes into like another struggle I have, is that I feel like she's tuning out. Yeah. When I'm trying to have serious conversations with her.
Why is she tuning out?
And I think it's just because she doesn't want to face it.
I would hypothesize it's because she is worried she's going to get steamrolled into doing something she doesn't want to do.
And that makes sense too.
Yeah. And so that's the best strategy we have, right? Is if our parent is older, has the money, has the power, our parent can basically make us do whatever they want us to do. And the only tool we have is resistance, right? And as a 2-year-old, 3-year-old, that looks like a tantrum. That looks like, no, I don't want to do this. As a 14-year-old, that looks like mentally and emotionally leaving the room. And so that's a protective strategy that she's using to say, if I'm not here, then this isn't really affecting me. Instead of being fully emotionally present in this relationship. So the challenge here is to invite her into this conversation. And I think dishes is actually a decent place to start, unless it is something that's so emotionally charged for you at this point. In that case, I would say, let's not do dishes. But dishes seems as though it's probably something that's sort of irritating to you, but it's not like the end of the world kind of scenario. So I think it's actually a really good opportunity to say, to give her some practice in understanding her needs and your needs, and saying, if we can find a way to meet my need, and I'm assuming, of course, that your need is to not carry the entire load of the family. If you have other needs related to, like, I have to come in at 2:00 and the dishes need to be done because X, then a strategy of having your child take out the trash is not going to meet that need, right? So it relies on you having articulated your need, and me having guessed that correctly as you not wanting to carry the entire load, and her understanding her need of not wanting to be bored, or wanting to have some say in what happens in the family. Well, we can meet those needs. Those are not mutually exclusive. There are ways that you can support this family and help me to meet my need while we also meet your need. And if she can see that, whenever she has an idea that can meet both people's needs, or together you can create an idea that meets both people's needs, that you will grab that and say, yes, let's do that. The more she's going to know that you want to hear her ideas, that you're invested in her, in her having her needs met. And then she wants to participate in these discussions with you. it becomes something that it's like, well, yeah, I want to have this conversation because I want to get my needs met. And I know you're going to help me try and do it. Rather than, it doesn't matter what I say, mom's going to make me wash the dishes. And so I'm just going to sit here, and at the end result is going to be the same no matter what I say. So I'm not going to say anything. Right? We have to open ourselves to the possibility that the thing we've been asking the child to do, to wash the dishes, may not be the ultimate solution that meets both of our needs. And if we can open ourselves to that possibility, then our child wants to participate because they know we're trying to meet their needs.
And it would seem that as these conversations happen, it's also like bringing it full circle, allowing that space to be there. Like it just like snowballs, but in a good way.
You're exactly right. Yes. Instead of getting in the negative spiral, you're getting in the positive spiral because more of our needs are being met more of the time. And when your needs are met more of the time, your window of tolerance is wider. Sure. And then you have the space to be able to pause. Even when your child rolls their eyes or does something that would normally have sent you over the edge, when you have that basis, that relationship that's grounded in meeting most people's needs most of the time, you find yourself in a place where you can pause, you can take that breath, and you can say, I am feeling super frustrated right now. And have them say, me too. And then maybe you make a conscious decision to say, can we take a 5-minute break and then come back again? Or I want to feel like we're on the same team right now. Can we just have a hug? Right? And from there, it's not like we're excusing whatever was the behavior that they just did and that's not an issue that needs to be dealt with. Maybe it is. Or maybe we've reappraised and we're like, yeah, that pressed my buttons and that's my thing to deal with. That's not necessarily their behavior that needs to change. But yes, absolutely. When more of our needs are met more of the time, we get to be on that positive cycle where more often we are able to respond to our child from a place that's connected with our values.
Awesome. And I know you mentioned earlier that you have a workshop, right, on taming your triggers, because I feel like this podcast episode has been great, but it's not going to be the cure-all. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's just not going to be the cure-all. This is going to take a little more work than a 30-minute, 40-minute podcast can give us. So can you tell me a little bit about what that workshop looks like? And how you can continue to support parents as we go through this process?
Yeah. And there's a reason for that, right? Because what we talked about earlier, the knowledge plus willpower equals change. If that was all it took, then I've basically given you what you need. But the problem is, it's really difficult to go from the knowledge in our heads to actually taking on an idea and living it in our bodies. That takes time. That takes a lot of support. That takes hearing from people who are processing things in their own ways and asking questions and thinking, oh, I didn't even know I had that question. And other people in a community with you answering that, and then it processes some more. And what often happens in the parents I work with is they experience what's called a non-cognitive shift, which means I didn't suddenly convince myself that this is how I want to respond to my child. But in some ways, something about how I'm showing up in the situation is just different. I'm not reciting a script anymore. I'm not trying to pretend that I'm not angry. It's just the pause is there and it wasn't there before. And that's the non-cognitive shift that's happened in our bodies. And so that's what we really work on in the workshop. It's 10 weeks. It starts on February 28th, and the registration's open between February 13th and 23rd. And then we start on the 28th of 2022. And we work on it for 10 weeks together. And we actually alternate the content that we work on. So every other week, we look at what are the causes of your triggers? Where did this stuff come from, so that you can understand it better, and we help you to process it, not just in your brain, but also in your body. And then every other week, we look at the tools that you are going to be using differently to show up in your relationship with your child, so that you can get practice using those through the duration. And also you don't get bogged down in figuring, in spending weeks and weeks and weeks understanding all the mucky stuff before you get to the tools. You actually get to practice alongside. So it's 10 weeks long, and you get invited to a community of parents. And the first revelation that parents have when they join this workshop is when they come into the community and they see hundreds of parents introducing themselves and saying all the things they find triggering about their children's behavior and the intentions that they're showing up with to do things differently. And they realize, I am not alone. It is not just me that has not figured this out.
Yes.
And that's an enormous relief for many parents. And so we go through and we discuss the materials, and you get the option to be paired up with what we call an encounter buddy, so that you can be held gently accountable for staying up to date with the content. So when your brain looks at the homework one week and thinks, oh, that's kind of scary, I'm going to put that off until tomorrow. And then you put it off to next week, and then you fall behind, and then you're like, oh, but now I'm behind and I can't ask a question about last week's content because we moved on, and I should probably just let this slide, and I'm not going to deal with it anymore. Your encounter buddy is the person who's going to say, this is important, and it doesn't matter what week of the content we're in, and let's hold ourselves accountable gently together for to create a nurturing environment that we can both thrive in. And what we find is that parents who have that support structure in place stick with it, and they really see the kinds of changes that they want to make in their lives, and they show up differently in their relationships with their families than they were able to before.
Thank you so much. And I love how you've talked about alternating. I think it's also really important. Like for me, I can't be alone in this. Like, I don't feel like I had a traumatic childhood. It was not perfect. No. Yeah. But like, yeah. I wouldn't call it traumatic, but I know that there are still influences with, from my childhood that have caused me to be the type of person I am, the type of parent I am. So I like how you have alternated that, and you're going to look at the root, like the generational root of the problem. And I'm using problem in air quotes, of the thing that needs to be changed. I love how that sounds. And I know for myself as a familypreneur, our families and our businesses are so intertwined. And if
they are.
Things are off in the family, it's going to reflect in your business. It's going to play a role in your business. The same way, if things are not going well in business, it can cause you to be more likely to be triggered by your family. So I know that by becoming a stronger parent, by opening up that communication with your children, and we didn't even talk about significant others, spouses and things like that, like getting them, because that's the other piece, right? Is getting them on board. Everybody has to be on board.
Yeah, that's important. I want to address what you said about not having experienced trauma. Yes, even though you may have not experienced what psychologists call either big T or little T trauma, which is, the really big stuff, or even, divorce and poverty, the conditions that can accompany poverty in our culture. And for those of you who are listening, I gave an eye roll there. We still experience trauma, right? When our parents said things to us like, oh, I know you love art, but art's never going to pay the bills. So do your homework and get a real job, right? That's the trauma of capitalism showing up in our lives. And that impacted us. And maybe we feel, oh, I shouldn't be creative. Being creative isn't a real thing, right? It can never be a real job. It's something that's just for fun. Or if our parents said to us, are you sure you want to eat that? You're getting a little chubby, right? That's white supremacy showing up. And the idealized body image, and they were doing the best they could to protect us in these environments, right? But they were trying to set us up for success, and yet that traumatized us. So I think it's super important that even if a parent is looking back thinking, well, I got nothing to complain about, I didn't experience any big trauma. Yes, we did. Just by living in this culture, we experienced trauma, and so there's a lot that we can do to heal from that trauma.
And then we need to learn what that all was.
Yes. Learn what it was first and then heal from it. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. I will put the link for the workshop in the show notes. So definitely make sure to go check that out. And where else can our listeners connect with you?
Yeah, everything that I do is on yourparentingmojo.com. So we've got over, I think, 150 episodes of research-based information for parents of children who were toddler years through about the end of elementary, with interviews with experts on topics from growth mindset to grit to to perfectionism. And so each time we dig really deep into what does the scientific research say on this topic and how can we use that information to inform our parenting.
Great. Thank you so much, Jen. Thanks for being here with us today and sharing so much information.
You're welcome, Meg. It was great to speak with you again.
All right, that is it for this episode of FamilyPreneur. Join us inside of the FamilyPreneur Business Accelerator to follow through on the action steps from this episode alongside an incredibly supportive community. Plus, access our robust training vault and a variety of exclusive monthly virtual events, including co-working, happy hours, and bonus training sessions. Head over to familypreneur.co and join us today. Until next time, I'll see you over in the FamilyPreneur Business Accelerator. Bye for now.